Welcome to UBG Bytes. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the security architecture of Apple platforms, how they protect your data, ensure software integrity, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
We're working from some really interesting sources today, excerpts from Apple's own Apple Platform Security Guide and a presentation called Code Signing Hashed Out.
Right. Both very detailed.
Exactly. And our mission really is to pull out the key insights. How does Apple secure these devices, right from the factory floor all the way to using apps every day? Let's try and connect the dots.
Sounds good. Where should we start? The foundation.
Yeah, let's start right at the core, the secure enclave.
Yeah.
What exactly makes this so fundamental?
Well, the secure enclave is, it's basically a dedicated processor within the main chip, completely
Like a
isolated,
vault inside the processor.
pretty much. And one of its absolutely crucial jobs is managing a unique ID, the UID.
Yeah.
Think of it as a root cryptographic key, totally unique to each specific device.
And not tied to anything else.
Nope, not linked to any other identifier.
Yeah.
Purely unique to that piece of silicon.
So like its own digital fingerprint baked right in.
Precisely. And here's a really key security aspect.
Hmm.
Since the A9 chip generation, the whole process of generating this UID and fusing it into the chip, it happens entirely within the secure enclave during manufacturing.
Ah, so it's isolated right from the start.
Exactly. That means even Apple or their manufacturing partners, they never actually see or have access to this fundamental key. It's the hardware root of trust, established securely.
Okay, that sounds like a seriously rock-solid foundation. Now, how does this tie into everyday use, like when we enter a passcode?
Right. So that's where the secure enclave works hand in hand with another piece, the secure storage component. They manage passcode attempts together using something called a counter lockbox.
A counter lockbox. Like it counts wrong tries.
Exactly that. The secure enclave sends over the passcode's entropy, basically how strong your passcode is and the maximum number of tries allowed. Then the secure storage component, using its own unique key, generates a random salt, mixes it with the passcode entropy, and creates a passcode verifier and something called lockbox entropy.
A verifier to check against.
Yes. And the lockbox gets set up with a counter at 0, the max attempts, that verifier, and the salt. The lockbox entropy then goes back to the secure enclave. It's all designed to make brute forcing your passcode incredibly difficult by hardware limiting attempts.
Wow, okay, so it's a whole cryptographic dance happening just to check a passcode. Very cool. Let's switch gears a bit. What about booting up the device or software updates? Image 4 signing keeps coming up.
Right, Image 4 files are absolutely critical. They contain the software needed for booting and updates. And to make sure only legitimate Apple-approved software runs, these files are all cryptographically signed.
Signed, meaning you can verify they haven't been tampered with and they came from Apple.
Exactly. It's like a digital seal of authenticity. Now, the rules embedded in these signatures, the certificate constraints can be interesting. They can be personalized, meaning they need a specific device's eSID.
The exclusive chip ID, unique to each chip.
That's the one. Or the constraints can be global, meaning they specifically prohibit an eSID. This lets Apple control precisely which software runs on which device.
Okay, so personalized for specific devices, global for broader use. How does this translate into the actual boot process, into policy?
Well, within each boot environment, like macOS or Recovery OS, there's something called the local policy.
Yeah.
And the rules from those Image 4 certificates get incorporated into this local policy as the remote policy.
Remote policy within the local policy.
Okay,
Right.
now for Recovery OS, this gets really strict. The remote policy there is designed to ensure it always operates with full security.
So even recovery mode is locked down tight.
Absolutely. The remote policy in Recovery OS must include the specific eSID of the Mac it was generated for. Plus, it includes something called a remote policy nonce hash, or RPNA.
RPNA, where does that live?
That's stored securely in the secure storage component of that specific Mac. And crucially, this RPNA, and therefore the remote policy, only changes when you do things related to Find My Mac or Activation Lock.
Ah, I see. So you can't just take the policy file from one Mac and use it to sign something for another Mac. The ECID and RPNH wouldn't match up.
Precisely. It prevents that kind of cross-device policy tampering.
Makes sense. Now, speaking of preventing misuse, what's this anti-replay mechanism with LPA?
Right, the LPAH, or Local Policy Nonce Hash.
Hmm.
This is specifically designed to stop replay attacks against the local policy itself. Think of it as a one-time use token for the current security rules.
A nonce hash.
Hmm.
How is it generated?
It's an SHA 384 hash of the local policy nonce, the LPN, and that LPN value is stored securely inside the secure storage component. only accessible to SepOS, the operating system running inside the secure enclave.
Okay, so another piece hidden away in the secure world. How does that stop someone reusing an old policy they might have captured?
Well, the actual nonce, the LPN, is never directly exposed to the main processor, so an attacker can't just grab it. They'd have an old LPN hash, but they'd need to somehow make the secure storage component generate a new LPN that hashes to that same old value, which is, cryptographically infeasible.
Right.
Normally, there's only one valid LPN active, but during software updates, they actually allow two LPNs temporarily.
Why two?
It allows for a smooth rollback. If the update fails, the system can fall back to the previous OS version, which used the previous LPN, without bricking the device.
That's clever. A safety net. So what triggers a new LPM?
Any change to any local policy on the device. If a user changes a security setting or a new OS is installed, all the policies get re-signed with a new LPN8 corresponding to a fresh LPN in secure storage. Keeps everything current and prevents reuse of outdated policies.
Okay, they've really thought about locking down that boot and update integrity, but what if the local recovery partition is corrupted? Internet recovery kicks in, right? How is that secured, especially if it downloads over plain HTTP?
Yeah, that's a great question. If local recovery fails, the Mac's firmware, UEFI, can indeed download Recovery OS and diagnostics from Apple over HTTP.
HTTP, not HTTPS. That sounds risky.
It does initially. But Apple has a clever way to verify the integrity. Even though it's HTTP, the downloaded disk images and associated chunk lists are verified just like local files.
Chunk lists?
Yeah, these lists contain cryptographic hashes like fingerprints for individual chunks of the downloaded data. So as each piece comes down over HTTP, the Mac verifies its hash against the chunk list. If a hash doesn't match, it means that chunk might have been tampered with.
And then what?
It just re-requests that specific chunk.
Yeah.
And it'll try up to 11 times before it gives up and shows an error.
11 times. Okay, they're serious about getting untempered data. But why use HTTP back in 2011 when they introduced this? Why not HTTPS from the start?
That was apparently a conscious design choice. Implementing the full complexity of HTTPS within the very low-level UEFI firmware was seen as potentially increasing the firmware's attack surface.
Making the firmware itself more complex and potentially vulnerable.
Exactly. So they opted for simpler HTTP transport, but put the critical integrity verification, using those chunk lists, at a higher software level after the download, a trade-off. Simpler firmware, robust content verification on top.
Fascinating trade-off. Okay, let's shift focus a bit towards data privacy, analytics data. What's Apple's stance on collecting that?
Their position, based on the documentation, is very much centered on user control and explicit consent. Analytics data, even stuff like app removal recommendations, is only sent to Apple if you, the user, specifically opt in within the Settings app.
So it's not on by default. You have to actively choose to share.
Correct. You have to go into Privacy and Security, then Analytics and Improvements, and enable sharing for iPhone, iPad, or Mac. It puts the choice firmly in the user's hands.
Good to know. All right, let's dive into some deeper technical defenses. Pointer authentication codes, or PACE, what are they doing?
PACE are really interesting hardware-level defense found on newer Apple silicon. Essentially, memory addresses, pointers, are cryptographically signed.
Signing the address itself, how?
They use some otherwise unused bits at the top of the 64-bit pointer address to store this cryptographic signature, the PC.
Clever use of spare bits. What's the security gain?
The big advantage is that before the system actually uses that pointer, like for a function call or return, it verifies the signature. If the signature check fails, it means the pointer might have been tampered with, and the process just aborts immediately.
Aborts, so it stops an attack.
Yes, it makes a whole class of memory corruption attacks much, much harder. Especially things like return-oriented programming, ROP.
ROP, where attackers hijack control flow by redirecting execution to existing code snippets, right?
Exactly. By signing those critical pointers, like return addresses on the stack, PI makes it incredibly difficult for attackers to overwrite them with malicious values and chain together those gadgets to execute arbitrary code. It's a fundamental hardening against control flow hijacking.
Sounds powerful. And building on that, there's also the page protection layer, PPL. What is that at?
PPL, which you find in iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, and visionOS, adds another strong layer of code integrity. Its main job is to prevent any modification of user space code after it's already been verified by the code signing process.
So once an app's code is loaded and checked, PPL locks it down.
That's the idea. It manages memory page permissions very tightly. Only the PPL system itself has the privilege to change permissions on these protected code pages and the page tables that map them.
And the benefit.
It provides system-wide enforcement of code integrity. And here's the really strong part. This protection holds even if the main operating system kernel gets compromised.
Wow, even if the kernel is hacked.
Yes, because PTL operates at a very fundamental level, managing the memory hardware permissions. Yeah. The document notes this is a key difference from macOS, which doesn't have PPL in the same way because macOS still permits unsigned code to run. PPL really relies on that everything must be signed model.
Interesting. A major architectural difference driven by the different security models. Okay, let's talk accessories. The MFI program made for iPhone iPad, what's its security role?
MFI is Apple's program for vetting and licensing third-party accessory makers. It ensures a certain standard of quality and compatibility, but it also has a crucial security component.
How so?
When an MFI-certified accessory connects, say, via Lightning or USB-C, it has to authenticate itself to the iPhone or iPad.
Prove it's legitimate.
Exactly. The accessory presents a certificate provided by Apple. The device verifies that certificate and then sends back a random challenge. The accessory must sign this challenge correctly and send the response back.
And how does the accessory do the signing?
That whole process is handled by a special, custom integrated circuit and IC that Apple provides only to licensed MFI manufacturers. It's all transparent to the user.
And what happens if it authenticates successfully?
A verified MFI accessory gets granted full access to certain functionalities and data transport protocols. Think high-quality digital audio, maybe specific location data access over Bluetooth, things like that.
If it's not MFI or fails authentication?
Its capabilities are significantly restricted. It might only get basic analog audio or very limited playback controls. The authentication IC basically acts as a gatekeeper for those enhanced features.
So it enforces a baseline trust level for accessories wanting deeper integration? Does AirPlay use something similar?
Yes, AirPlay also uses that same authentication IC to verify receivers. And the actual audio and CarPlay video streams are encrypted using something called MFISA Secure Association Protocol.
Encrypted how?
With AES-128 encounter mode. And the keys for that encryption are temporary, session-specific keys.
How are those keys exchanged securely?
They use elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, specifically curve 25519, to agree on a shared secret. And that key exchange process itself is signed using the authentication IC's own RSA key as part of the station-to-station protocol. Ensures the key exchange is authentic and secure.
Secure key exchange. Critical stuff. Okay, shifting to Macs with Apple Silicon, they run native ARM64 code, but also older by 8664 code via Rosetta 2. How does code signing handle that mix?
Right. On Apple Silicon Macs, native ARM64 code absolutely must have a valid signature to run. No exceptions.
Strict policy there.
Very. But for by 86664 code, it's a bit more nuanced for compatibility. If the system recognizes the code signature hash of an 8664 app as being in the static trust cache, basically a list of known trusted software.
Like pre-approved by Apple?
Sort of, yeah. Then the system also expects the hash of its translated, ahead-of-time compiled ARM64 version, the AOT artifact, to also be in that cache. These aren't signed with a device key, but they're trust anchors back to Apple's secure boot chain.
Okay, but what about by 86664 code that isn't in that cache?
Interestingly, the documentation states that unsigned by 86664 code is permitted to run on Apple Silicon Macs.
Really? Unsigned code?
Yes. Unlike ARM64 code, it's likely a concession for broader compatibility with the vast amount of existing Mac software out there.
That's a significant policy difference. Okay, let's touch on storage structure. APFS volumes, how does that contribute?
APFS plays a key role, especially on macOS 11 and later. The system actually boots from a read-only snapshot of the main system volume.
The snapshot, like a frozen copy.
Exactly. So even if something somehow managed to write to the underlying system volume after that snapshot was taken, the running OS is based on that pristine, verified snapshot. It guarantees the integrity of the core OS files you're actually running from.
Very clever. What about iOS and the others?
On iOS, iPadOS, visionOS, storage is typically divided into at least two main APFS volumes, a system volume and a separate data volume.
System and data separation.
Yeah, it's fundamental. Keeps the core OS files isolated and protected from user data and apps running in the user space. There are also some shared volumes like pre-boot, VM, and recovery.
That separation seems crucial. Okay, protecting sensitive stuff like passwords, The keychain.
Right. The keychain is the secure storage for passwords, keys, certificates, tokens. The important thing to note is that how the keychain protection guarantees are enforced can differ slightly across Apple's operating systems.
Also,
For instance, the document points out that macOS doesn't directly use the data protection classes in the same way iOS does to enforce keychain item protection. They achieve similar goals, but the underlying mechanisms might vary based on the platform architecture.
so consistent user experience, but maybe different plumbing underneath. What about encrypting the whole drive on a Mac? File vault.
Exactly. When you turn on File Vault, it encrypts the entire APFS volume. Once it's on, you absolutely need valid credentials, your password, or a recovery key just to boot the Mac or access startup modes.
So someone, say, stole the Mac or pulled the drive out.
The data is useless to them without that password or recovery key. The encryption protects the data at rest, even if the physical storage is removed. It's a critical defense against physical access threats.
Definitely a strong deterrent. Shifting online now, protecting our Apple accounts, what measures are in place?
Apple uses a multi-pronged approach. They have policies to limit sign-in and password reset attempts, to thwart brute force attacks.
Right.
They also employ active fraud monitoring systems, looking for suspicious activity. And they state they regularly review and update these policies based on new threats.
What about accounts used in schools or businesses? Managed Apple IDs.
For those, the password policies are actually set by the organization's administrator through Apple School Manager or Business Manager, giving the org more control.
Makes sense. And for personal accounts, two-factor authentication, 2FA.
That's the default now for Apple accounts. It's crucial. It means just having the password isn't enough to get in.
You need the password and something else.
Right. You need the password plus that 6-digit verification code that pops up on your trusted devices or gets sent to a trusted phone number whenever you try to sign in on a new device or browser.
That 6-digit code prompt we see all the time.
Exactly. Entering that code proves you trust the new device. It dramatically increases account security because an attacker would need both your password and physical access to one of your trusted devices or your trusted phone number. It's deeply integrated everywhere.
Absolutely essential. Okay, let's talk Apple Wallet. It holds more than just payment cards now. Keys for homes, cars, student IDs. How's the security handled there?
Yeah, Wallet has expanded quite a bit. For things like student IDs, home keys, car keys, there's a feature called Express Mode.
Express mode.
It lets you use a key, tap your phone, or watch near a reader without having to authenticate with Face ID, Touch ID, or passcode first, or even double-click the watch button. Super convenient.
Convenient, yes, but is it less secure if you don't authenticate? It's often on by default, right?
It typically is enabled by default for that seamless experience. But, and this is key, the user can always turn Express Mode off for any specific key in the Wallet app settings. If you turn it off, you'll need to authenticate to use the key. And if you want to turn it back on, you have to authenticate then too. So user control is there.
Okay, so you can choose convenience or require authentication. What about adding student IDs? Any extra checks?
Yes. When you add a student ID via the school's app, the process is similar to adding a payment card. Importantly, those issuing apps must support two-factor authentication on the student's account that manages the ID. Helps ensure only the right student can add their ID.
Good. And home keys for apartment buildings and such, how do those get into Wallet?
Usually through a partner app provided by the property management. They can also use frictionless provisioning, sending a secure link via email or SMS that the tenant just taps to add the key. Sometimes they use app clips too, so you don't even need the full partner app installed initially.
Streamlined but secure provisioning. And car keys using ultra-wideband, UWB. That allows precise location for unlocking, right? How's it secured?
Right, UWB is for that fine-grained ranging. It starts with a secure Bluetooth low-energy connection to establish a shared secret key between your device and the car.
Okay.
That secret is then used to derive a specific UWB ranging secret key, the URSK. This URSK is securely loaded onto the UWB chips in both your device and the car.
And that URSK enables the secure ranging.
Exactly. It allows the car to know precisely where your device is. Are you approaching? Are you inside? To make decisions like unlocking or allowing the engine to start. And to keep it smooth, new URSKs can be pre-generated in the background and stored securely, ready to take over when the current one expires. Prevents any lag.
Pre-deriving keys for speed.
Nice.
Briefly, general wireless Wi-Fi and Bluetooth.
Apple devices generally support the latest standards. WPA3 is common on newer devices, including WPA3 Enterprise with 192-bit security, which can use stronger 256-bit AES encryption on compatible networks. and both Bluetooth Classic and BLE have their own built-in security features.
Keeping up in the standards, good. What about Siri? Privacy and security there, especially with accessories.
Right, some accessories have a Touch for Siri button. Pressing it sends audio frames directly to a paired HomePod.
Not straight to Apple servers from the accessory.
No, it goes via the HomePod. And the HomePod sends it to Apple's service with the same end-to-end encryption and privacy protections as if you'd spoken directly to the HomePod. The accessory is just a secure microphone input.
Okay. And when Siri interacts with third-party apps, how is data sharing controlled?
Siri uses app extensions for that. Crucially, before Siri shares any personal data like contacts or location with an app extension, it checks the user's permissions for that specific app.
So the app only gets what you've allowed it to access.
Precisely. And it only gets the relevant part of your request. If you ask Siri to message my brother using App X, but App X doesn't have contact permission, the app extension just gets the text my brother, not the actual contact info. It's based on the principle of least privilege.
That's a solid privacy design. Okay, managing device usage, screen time. How does security work there?
Screen time lets you monitor usage, set limits, schedule downtime across iPhone, iPad, Mac, even some Apple Watch features. If you're using it for personal management, your settings and usage data can sync across your devices signed into the same iCloud account.
How is that sync protected?
It uses CloudKit end-to-end encryption, which means Apple can't see that data. However, this requires that your iCloud account has two-factor authentication enabled.
Which is the default anyway.
Right. So the sensitive usage data stays private. Screen time basically consolidated the old restrictions and parental controls features into one place.
End-to-end encryption is key there. Okay, let's really dig into code signing now. Using insights from that code signing hashed out presentation, Apple introduced it way back in OS X 10.5 Leopard.
Yeah, quite early on, alongside sandboxing. The presentation notes that while other OCs use signatures, Apple's implementation is arguably more fundamental to the system's security model.
What were the main drivers, just knowing where software came from?
That was definitely primary in truism, authenticating the origin, mitigating malware risks by vetting developers. But there was more. Security profiles, or entitlements, are actually embedded in the signature.
Entitlements in the signature.
Yes. This enables what the presentation calls declarative security. The signature itself declares what the app is allowed to do, what resources it can access. It defines the sandbox rules.
Okay, so origin and capabilities.
Right. And the presentation mentions a third aspect, maybe an unexpected bonus. It gives Apple significant control over software distribution. On iOS, only Apple's signature is allowed, effectively creating the App Store model. OS X historically has been more open, allowing other signatures and even unsigned code, though the presentation hints that might tighten over time.
That iOS versus macOS signing difference is huge. How are these signatures technically structured? Macho format.
Correct. Macho is Apple's executable format. It contains load commands that tell the system how to load and run the code. Things like LC segment for memory layout, lcodylib for library dependencies, and LC code designator.
This signature has its own load command.
Exactly. And the actual signature data resides within a specific segment called linkedIt, which holds various metadata. Tools like JTool let you inspect all these commands and segments.
And there was a mention of task forbid for inspecting things.
Yeah, that's a low-level system call. With the right privileges, it lets you peek into the kernel's internal structures. In the context of code signing, you can use it with specific subcommands, like cdh to ahh to get the code directory hash, or entitlements blob to extract the embedded entitlements directly from the kernel's representation of a running process. Powerful for analysis.
Definitely deep inspection tools. Now, how is this all enforced when you actually launch an app? The dynamic linker, DILD.
DILD is the gatekeeper at launch time. It's responsible for loading the application and all the dynamic libraries it depends on. The presentation highlights a specific load command, LCD Light Lib Code Binders.
TRS.
Dynamic Library Code Signing Dependency Record Segments. Rolls right off the tongue, eh?
Catchy. Why was it added?
It was introduced around iOS 5.1 and OS X 10.8, specifically in response to research like Charlie Miller's work, showing ways to potentially load unsigned libraries into signed apps. This DRS command lets the main executable specify requirements for the libraries it loads.
Closing a loophole. Who does the actual validation check?
The heavy lifting is done by the security daemon managed by Launched. Security uses a library, libnis.dulib, which contains functions like emisValidate signature to perform the actual cryptographic verification of the signatures against the system's policies and provisioning profiles.
So a dedicated background process handles the validation, and in the kernel itself, AMFI.
Yep. Apple Mobile File Integrity, AMFI. That's the kernel subsystem that ultimately enforces the code signing policies at the lowest level. It hooks into the system calls related to loading and executing code.
Can it be turned off?
The presentation mentions it can technically be disabled via kernel boot arguments. However, it also notes that iBoot, the early bootloader, stopped passing those arguments on release devices from iOS 5 onwards. So while maybe theoretically possible with an iBoot exploit, it's designed to be always on and enforcing on production devices.
So practically speaking, it's a core, non-bypassable enforcement layer. Finally, let's revisit ROP attacks. The presentation mentioned Jekyll apps. What were they? Jekyll apps. That was a fascinating piece of research presented back in 2013. The idea was to create an app that looked completely benign and harmless during Apple's App Store review process.
So it gets signed by Apple.
Exactly. But hidden inside was an alternative code path designed to trigger a return-oriented programming attack. After the app was installed on a user's device, it could potentially contact a remote server, get instructions, and then trigger this hidden ROP payload, effectively subverting itself.
Wow. Using existing code gadgets maliciously.
Precisely. ROP relies on finding small snippets of existing legitimate code gadgets within the application or system libraries, like in the DILD shared cache, and chaining them together by manipulating return addresses on the stack to perform actions the original developers never intended.
So even though the initial app code was signed and verified, it could still be made to misbehave later by exploiting these existing code fragments. The Jekyll research really highlighted that code signing, while crucial for verifying origin and initial integrity, isn't a silver bullet against all forms of exploitation, especially those that dynamically manipulate existing code execution flows. Apple has added mitigations since then, like checking memory map sizes, but it shows the complexity of the challenge.
A real cat and mouse game. Code signing is vital, but not foolproof on its own.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a foundational layer, but security requires defense in depth.
So wrapping this up, it's clear Apple uses this incredibly multi-layered security architecture. It's constantly evolving, right? From hardware roots like the secure Enclave through rigorous software signing, secure communication protocols, even down to accessory verification. Security seems deeply integrated everywhere.
It really is. And what's striking is that constant interplay. You mentioned the cat and mouse game. Security researchers find new angles. Apple responds with new defenses like TACI and PPL. It shows a deep commitment to continually hardening the platforms.
Absolutely. And this deep dive hopefully has shed some light on how complex and interconnected it all is. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Considering all these measures we've discussed, what parts of your digital life on these platforms do you feel most secure about now? And conversely, what areas, if any, still raise questions or concerns for you?
That's a great question for listeners to ponder.
It's definitely a complex landscape. Understanding these fundamentals, even at a high level, is really key to navigating it all more safely. If you are interested in digging even deeper, we definitely recommend checking out the full Apple Platform Security document. It's dense, but fascinating.